Believe it or not, Northeastern Indiana has an extensive history in civil rights activism, events, and even monuments. In fact, over 50 years ago, on February 1st, 1968, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. would give his last ever campus address prior to his assassination. He spoke to an overflow audience at the local campus of what is now known as Manchester University. Manchester was the first undergraduate peace studies program in the entire world. Manchester's campus resides in North Manchester, approximately 50 minutes away from Fort Wayne's Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Memorial Bridge. This is another monumental piece of local history, a bridge built in 2012 to honor MLK Jr. and his everlasting influence on our community in northeastern Indiana. But today, we talk about a piece of Indiana civil rights history that not only immediately changed the outcome of history back then, but continues to inspire people today. In 1968, Robert F. Kennedy, younger brother of President John F. Kennedy, announced his run for president in the election that was set to take place that same year. His campaign was short, only lasting 83 days. It followed the withdrawal of the previous frontrunner for the Democratic Party, Lyndon B. Johnson. In his absence, many competed for the selection of the Democratic primaries, the two most prominent being New York Senator Kennedy and Minnesota Senator Hubert Humphrey. The two men featured much in common, both actively working for civil rights and both having a major focus on labor reform. The two, however, still had their differences. Humphrey, while progressive, played moderate to appeal to the Southern Democrat crowd and focused less on growing civil rights movements and more on economics and foreign relations. Kennedy, on the other hand, made civil rights the focus of his brief campaign, speaking constantly on the importance of reform and desegregation.
Many nations have set forth their own definitions and declarations of these principles, and there have often been wide and tragic gaps between promise and performance, ideal and reality. Yet the great ideals have constantly recalled us to our own duties, and with painful slowness, we in the United States have extended and enlarged the meaning and the practice of freedom to all of our people. For 2 centuries, my own country has struggled to overcome the self-imposed handicap of prejudice and discrimination based on nationality, on social class, or race, discrimination profoundly repugnant to the theory and to the command of our Constitution.
On April 4th, 1968, Martin Luther King was assassinated. He was standing on a balcony when a white supremacist affiliate in Memphis, Tennessee, shot him. King had been speaking to Reverend Jesse Jackson, a fellow civil rights activist and later senator, when all of a sudden a single shot rang out ahead of him. He was struck across the face and was rushed to St. Joseph's Hospital, where he died shortly after. Word of King's death spread nearly instantaneously through student union communities and the civil rights community, and America at whole was rocked by the leader's death. Kennedy was flying out to Indianapolis to give a campaign speech in his bid for the Hoosier State when he had learned of King's news. Having boarded the plane, he had learned that King had been shot, and by the time he landed, only 2 hours later, he had learned that King was dead. According to John Lindsay, an accompanying journalist, upon hearing of King's death, Kennedy sat in disbelief before shrinking back in his seat, clutching his face, and uttering the words, "Oh God, when will this stop?" Upon his departure from the airport, chief advisors urged Kennedy to cancel his rally and reconvene at his campaign headquarters. Kennedy insisted on speaking, and instead drove straight to the rally site. Kennedy then dismissed the speeches prepared for him, and instead read off of notes that were likely written on the way there.
Do they know about Martin Luther King?
We have left it up to you to let it can be handled.
Could you lower those signs, please? I have some very sad news for all of you, and that is that Martin Luther King was shot and was killed tonight in Memphis. Martin Luther King dedicated his life to love and to justice between fellow human beings. He died in the cause of that effort. In this difficult day, in this difficult time for the United States, it's perhaps well to ask what kind of a nation we are and what direction we want to move in. For those of you who are black, considering the evidence evidently is that there were white people who were responsible, you can be filled with bitterness and with hatred and a desire for revenge. We can move in that direction as a country, in greater polarization, black people amongst blacks and white amongst whites, filled with hatred toward one another. Or we can make an effort, as Martin Luther King did, to understand and to comprehend and replace that violence, that stain of bloodshed that is spread across our land, with an effort to understand, compassion, and love.
Around 2,500 people were estimated to be present in the audience that night. But despite the relatively small presence, the speech is recognized to have massively boosted the perception of Kennedy in Indiana. And more importantly, Kennedy's address was a continuation of the path Dr. King had forged, focused on the importance of seeking peace rather than violence. The audience that night was primarily made up of working-class African Americans, many of whom worked within the civil rights movement itself. Kennedy is often cited as a voice and a presence that helped console the devastated community. William Crawford, a civil rights activist, credited Kennedy's speech for preventing possible riots. Later in an interview given in 2015, Crawford quoted, "Look at all those other cities. I believe it would have gone that way had Bobby Kennedy not given those remarks." The speech itself has become widely recognized as one of the most influential in American history. A survey of scholars ranked Kennedy's address as the 17th most important in all of American history. A monumental feat for a speech draft in such a short time and given in front of such a small audience. In the prologue to his book, Politics Lost, journalist Joe Klein names it "Politics in its grandest form and highest purpose." On June 5, 1968, 1 month after the killing of Martin Luther King, Robert Kennedy was shot in Los Angeles, California. Kennedy was rushed to Good Samaritan Hospital, but the shot, having hit his head, had effectively killed him on the spot. Kennedy was later pronounced dead just the next day. Hubert Humphrey took up the role of Democratic nominee following Kennedy's death. The formal rival was battered, remarking to the Senate that night, "We have lost a great American, a man whose deep concern, compassion, conscience, and commitment have inspired all of us in this chamber." Humphrey would eventually go on to lose the election to Republican nominee Richard Nixon and would retire from presidential runs onward. Today, a plaque sits upon the street corner telling the story of Kennedy's address. Here, on the evening of April 4th, 1968, Robert Kennedy came to address a large crowd of mostly African Americans in his bid for Democratic Party nomination for the President of the United States. Instead, visibly shaken, he gave an impromptu speech about the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. that day in Memphis, Tennessee. Kennedy urged the crowd to follow Reverend King's lead and respond with understanding and prayer, citing the need to avoid division, hatred, and violence. He called for love, wisdom, compassion, and justice. Today, in MLK Jr. Park in Indianapolis, sits a monument, a sculpture of the two men emerging out of two parallel walls, reaching out to one another in a warm, welcoming embrace, forever honoring the two men's compassion, wisdom, and friendship.